we would like to read what we have in the award. Navanethem Sangam USA. Lifetime Service Award presented to Honorable Judge Navanethem Pillay in recognition of her decades-long dedication to seeking truth, justice and human rights around the world and her contribution to all humanity. Awarded on November 5, 2016, Navanethem Sangam 39 AGM, New Jersey, USA. On behalf of everyone here and our members and even all Tamils in the world, what we can do for what people to us. Congratulations, Judge Pillay.
Get the Ponade first and then... So, for that, we welcome for your keynote address. Thank you.
Vanakkam, I'm really very happy to be here, and I bring you greetings from the Tamil community of South Africa. We also had many efforts to preserve our culture and values, and when I saw the children singing just now, yes, I was one of them. We were brought up very strictly as Tamils. We spoke Tamil at school, at home, and of course we didn't wear shoes at home. Also, we were too poor to have the shoes anyway. But we sang all the Thevaram songs, and I ended up as a 10-year-old. I'd reached the highest standard in Tamil at school, and they made me a teacher. And so I really apologize that because of the context in which we grew up in South Africa, that we were not using the Tamil language and we've forgotten, but I intend to get back to it. Thank you for the kind but very long introduction. Let me add a little to that, a brief history. Most of you, of course, left Sri Lanka and were forced to leave Sri Lanka at a critical time. And I want to salute all of you for what you're doing for the people of Sri Lanka. You didn't just come out here and think just about yourself. So I'm truly moved by all the programs and the help that you are extending to the people. You know, I went there. I know that they look to you for your support. Not just your financial support, but your moral support. Your strength and courage has to filter down to them, has to reach them. And I think that you really, all your programs are truly beneficial. I love the tradition of giving and generosity that I hear has happened amongst this community. So let me also thank you for that. My grandfather was an indentured labourer. He was brought from Tamil Nadu to work in the sugarcane fields. So also my maternal grandfather, this is my paternal grandfather, and we trace that he comes from Vatlagundu in Madras. And my father was a bus driver, and he could not go to school because my grandfather lost both his arms in an accident in the sugarcane factory there. And so my father, as an 8-year-old, had to take over and drive the horse and cart and so on. And my mother was denied education because her father said if she learned to read and write, she will write love letters to boys. So he never sent her to school. And you look at these two parents, their one priority was to ensure that all their 7 children were educated. So amongst the girls, we are 4 of us. 2 are retired school principals, and 2 of us are judges, my younger sister and I. So these indentured laborers who earned so little and lived in barracks, and their condition was described by Gandhi as semi-slavery. They couldn't do much for themselves, but they thought of the next generation, and so they built schools. Even today, we have to remind the majority African population in South Africa about self-help. You have to help yourself sometimes, and this is what the Tamil community mainly did to educate its young. I was in high school in Clearwood, a suburb which was occupied by Indians, largely Tamils. The school principal and teachers went around door to door and told the community, we have a young girl who has the potential to go to university. It will be a waste not to send her to university. So it was my community that contributed the money that enabled me to go to university. And this is why I appreciate what you are doing in helping children out there in Sri Lanka. You are opening doors for them. And recently I had a wonderful opportunity at a huge public gathering to thank my community and tell them what I had done as a result of the opportunity they gave me. Now you heard that I was the first woman of color to be appointed a judge. It was an acting judge position. And President Mandela called me at home. It was a Saturday morning, and the woman said, hold on for the president. And I thought, this is my brother, Pulindaran, who's playing the fool. Why would the president phone me, especially on a Saturday morning? But it was him. And he said, the announcement of, he appointed me. Your appointment as a judge gives me great pride, and I hope it will become permanent soon. You see, he didn't say, I'm trying you out and see that you do well. And I didn't dare say, oh, why me? You think I can do the job? So if you have the community placing their trust in you, and a leader such as him placing their trust in you, then you can bet, and of course my parents and their values, you can bet that I was amply fortified to undertake the international positions I did. It came because of the values that were instilled in us. So I also now want to tell you that this is so important to have this cultural values and identity, because when I sat as a judge on the Rwanda tribunal, there you know that almost 800,000 Tutsis were killed over 100 days, not by weapons of mass destruction, but by handheld machetes. So neighbors suddenly killed one another or raped their girls. And the witnesses would say how they all were living together harmoniously for years and years, and suddenly the neighbors came down, killed their cows, which is a very, very important signal, because there's an unwritten law that all farmers obey. You will not steal the next farmer's crops or his cattle. So the fact that the people stole their cattle, cut the meat up and roasted it, and I was wondering, and I'm here listening to genocide, why are they talking about roasting cattle? But you can see the significance of the breakdown of law. As soon as they stole the cattle and nothing happened to them, it went on to killings. And that's when I thought, what would we do in a crisis situation like that, under pressure? Would we go around killing babies and children, people we know, and neighbors? So what safeguards us? How can we prevent this level of violence, which also happened in former Yugoslavia, remember? I was talking to a woman doctor from former Yugoslavia, and she worked with these 2 Serbian doctors in the same ward for 12 years, and suddenly they turned around and raped her. So it always puzzles me what changes human behavior and how we can safeguard this. And I feel it's the values, the identity, and to realize where you come from and the trust placed in you. So Bhalan would like me to speak on Sri Lanka, and I've been listening to all your activities with regard to Sri Lanka, and I see very many experts and activists in this hall. Really, you know far more about how to advance the protection of human rights in Sri Lanka than I would. So I want to respect that many of you know what the situation is like, and you're actively working to support people there to realize their dreams. I focus on Sri Lanka because of the tremendous violations that were taking place in front of our eyes. We could see the shelling during the last days of the conflict. We could hear these civilians crying out, praying to God, and yet the whole world did nothing. We just watched in silence. Now, the United Nations had done the same in Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, and many other places. And here it was all being repeated in Sri Lanka. Now, it's true, as our MC said, the Sri Lankan government came in powerful numbers to stop any discussion of the Sri Lankan handling of the conflict before the Human Rights Council. They argued that this was their sovereign affairs. It would be an interference in their internal affairs if the international body looked at it. They successfully managed to keep it off the agenda of the Security Council and the UN General Assembly. And really, that's where it should have been addressed. So along came wonderful activists, both from inside Sri Lanka, the UK, and others, and worked very closely with my colleagues. And it's true that when that huge delegation was down, I heard a report that they were harassing the Sri Lankan NGO and activists. And we then, I said, investigated immediately. So I'm talking about the situation in this country. So we found that it was the driver of the ambassador of Sri Lanka in Geneva who was taking pictures. He would bring his camera just close to their faces and take pictures. And so, yes, it meant you act immediately. You know, we can remove people from the hall, we can stop people from attending the meetings. Not the ambassador, of course, but his staff. So, you're right, that is just one of very many acts of harassment that activists put up with, particularly the objections to them holding side events in Geneva. So, we have to recognize the role played by civil society in pushing for this matter to be on the agenda. To do that, they had to approach other governments. And this is where you are so important. You approached the United States government. There was an approach to the UK government. And sadly, my own country, South Africa, the Mandela country, voted with Sri Lanka. They agreed that this is an internal matter. So the first resolution, South Africa objected to the Human Rights Council examining the situation because they said it's an internal matter. I have been speaking a great deal in South Africa right now to universities and public audiences, bringing to their notice the positions adopted by South Africa in respect of Sri Lanka and in respect of other places, because the position they are adopting goes against our constitution. But really they were friends of Sri Lankans, and yet they let them down in that first resolution. So I think it was very important that you moved countries to support the second resolution. Now, my role inside was how to get it onto the agenda of some forum. And so the way we did it is we persuaded the Secretary General to set up a panel. And so I joined the high-level meetings in New York for that. The Sri Lankan government, accompanied by many other ambassadors, came to the Secretary General and literally shouted at him to say he has no jurisdiction, he's a public civil servant, and he shouldn't be setting up a panel. The legal counsel and I found a precedent where it was done one time, a long time ago, by a Secretary General. And we persuaded the Secretary General, you do have the jurisdiction. So that's the only panel you got, which is the Secretary General's panel, not supported by any member states. That panel, one of them was a South African member of that panel. Of course, we're not allowed into Sri Lanka by the government. They were denied access. But they saw all the NGOs, both inside and outside, and there was enough evidence, as we all know. This is another factor why the important role of activists is to gather the information, make sure that it's factual and true, and that will enable others to use it. Those court cases that I sent on would never have happened had witnesses not come forward and volunteered the testimony. So you can't have court cases if people don't come forward with great courage and testify. And some of them, of course, were NGO activists, journalists, and so on, who gathered the information. That panel found great violations on the part of Sri Lanka, said that the acts amounted to war crimes and crimes against humanity. And they also criticized the United Nations. So then you had another panel which looked into the UN's role in Sri Lanka, found that the UN had failed Sri Lankans. They could have stayed and prevented the killings, saved lives. They did not do so. Instead, they just packed up and rushed out of there. So as a result of that panel, inside the UN, at a high level, they now adopted the policy of not how to get out of their fast, but how to stay and protect. So, I know that Sri Lankans paid with their blood for the UN to change its policy 60 years after it was established. And it did work. So when there was conflict in South Sudan, with the fighting between the president and the vice president, and the one ethnic group was attacking the other, people fled from their farms and so on, and they fled to the UN compound. Now, under the old policy, as they did in Sri Lanka, the UN would have shut its gates and kept these people out, kept the refugees out, and they would have been massacred. So this was the first time that the UN opened its gates, and 90,000 people crammed in there, and so 90,000 lives were saved. So once again, it's the blood of Sri Lankans still giving us good outcomes internationally for the future. And another is the emphasis that human rights is the concern of every agency in the UN. Previously, they acted in their silos. And this is why what you had in Sri Lanka was the humanitarian affairs coordinator. And human rights was not his department. He didn't know what to do when these killings happened. And the government instructed the UN not to step in, to stay within their offices and so on. And this is what they did. They stayed in their offices instead of going out there to see what's happening to the people, because they felt it was not their role. They're not human rights activists. So, it shocked me, as I'm sure it shocks you, that this is the way they operated for 65 years. So, as a result of these panels and a lot of activity from human rights people inside the UN, that policy has been changed, and that's what was referred to now as the Secretary General's Rights Up Front Action Plan, is where you protect the human rights of communities immediately. Of course, the only forum in which Sri Lanka has been addressed is the Human Rights Council. As you know, you've been following this. It was a huge struggle to get where we wanted. I called for an international independent judicial tribunal. And, so based on the facts and the information that we had, based on my experience as a judge on the Rwanda Tribunal and the International Criminal Court, I was in a position to fit those facts into international law, and therefore very authoritatively said that based on these facts, there's good reason to believe that the crimes against humanity and war crimes were committed, particularly during the last stages, but by both sides of the conflict. And of course the Sri Lankan government did not accept that. They were still selling the story that they were dealing with terrorism. And this was accepted by the international community because many other countries were dealing with terrorism, they were dealing with Syria, and they felt that this was then a legitimate act on the part of the Sri Lankan government. Now, even if we look at it as counter-terrorism, I mean, here you have acts of terrorism, and of course you want to be protected against terrorists. That's reasonable. What is not reasonable is to think that you can go above the rule of law just because you're dealing with terrorism. The UN has very strict guidelines that you have to respect human rights, even in counter-terrorism measures, and that you cannot exceed the rule of law. So it's very strictly governed. So I must say to you that when Osama bin Laden was killed here, and Americans were welcoming it as a great achievement, and the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon also said that justice has been done, and media asked me what I thought, and I said no. This is extrajudicial execution. No country is above the rule of law. There should be full disclosure of what happened in the killings. And so people from the US phoned me to say, oh, you're very brave to say that. But you'll agree with me, that's a true statement. The same rules should apply to all states. Again and again, I've heard other representatives of governments say, well, the United States is not being accountable, why should we? This comes up even from the youth I've addressed in many universities in Africa. They've said to me, don't come and talk to us about human rights, go and talk to the US. And I did have an opportunity to speak to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and said to her, this is not government, this is the youth, the next generation that is very, very angry with the United States for double standards. Which then brings me to the UN itself. That clearly there are double standards and selective justice. And this is why there are divisions now, where developing countries are taking up attitudes against developed countries. And if any initiative comes from the West, even if it's for the good, then this group blocks it. So we are all now caught in these political divisions that are being played out there. The one body that has a responsibility in the United Nations to protect people is the Security Council. They have the power. Their mandate is to look after peace, security, and development. And when my predecessor was taken into the Security Council by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, she was asked to leave the Security Council by one of the members who said, this is not the place for human rights. What is she doing here? She must leave. And I've told them back home, guess who was the ambassador who said that? Yeah, that is that South African ambassador. This is democratic South Africa. So people at home are very shocked. They don't know these things. You see, it's very, very important when you have information, that you spread that information. And so I said to the Secretary General, I would like to go to the Security Council. Now, because I was making statements in the Human Rights Council, the Security Council invited me first to their retreat for new members. And this is where I spoke about human rights, and some of the ambassadors said to me, well, we're very surprised that you are taking up a position against your own government. And I said, I'm the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This is my mandate. You states have given me the mandate. This is the charter. These are all the conventions. How can you even deal with peace, security, and development without hearing about human rights? Because human rights violations are an alert of worse things to come. Remember that the Syrian conflict started when people took to the streets in a peaceful protest for rights, because they were excluded from government. They didn't have political or economic rights, and this is what they were asking for inclusion. And instead of holding a dialogue with them, they were shot at. So my first speech was before the Security Council, saying 1,000 people have been killed today, and they were peaceful protesters. And right to protest is a human right, and so on. So thereafter, I went about 15 times before the Security Council. Now, they didn't have Sri Lanka on their agenda. They just have certain countries that where they say there's a threat to international peace. That's the criteria when a country gets examined before the Security Council. And that's why Syria is an issue there, because of all the refugee situation. But they heard about Sri Lanka through me. Once they allowed the High Commissioner in, I took the opportunity of raising other matters as well. Now, I said to them that sovereign states built the international human rights framework precisely because they knew that human rights violations can cause conflict, which in turn undermines sovereignty. So early action to address human rights concerns protect states by warding off the threat of devastating violence and forced displacement. And recognition of this urgent truth and a broader conception of what is in the national interest would, I said, be more appropriate to a century in which a growing number of challenges face humanity as a whole. A number of good practices that address both proximate triggers and root causes have emerged. And these, I said, include strengthening civil society actors, increasing participation by women in decision-making and dialogue, and addressing institutional and individual accountability for past crimes and for serious human rights violations. And this is a view I stated in August 2014 in my last address before the Security Council. And I stated this view pointing out that the use of the veto to stop actions intended to stop or diffuse conflict. You know, they have used the veto when human rights violations were before them. I pointed out that both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher used the veto to stop a resolution on sanctions against apartheid South Africa. So I told them they used the veto to support racism. And the UN is against racism. The collective interest, I said, defined clearly by the Charter of the United Nations, is in the national interest of every country. Now we have to hammer home this message, because we cannot have the Assads and the Rajapaksas of the world defying international law. This is why the UN was set up. So despite these repeated briefings regarding escalating violations in multiple crises, there has not always been a firm and principled decision by the Security Council members to put an end to conflicts. Short-term geopolitical considerations and national interests narrowly defined have been given preference over intolerable human suffering and over grave breaches of and long-term threats to international peace and security. Political posturing also determines whether burning issues get onto the agenda of the Security Council. The conflict in Sri Lanka, as I said, was not addressed by the Security Council or the General Assembly, even though the shelling of thousands of civilians, the bombing of hospitals and homes by government forces played out on world television screens. So on prevention of conflict, I suggested that the Security Council take a number of innovative steps to prevent threats to international peace and security. Now, so at a farewell breakfast, this is what the P5 shared with me, that actually they don't have tools, they don't have enforcement powers. So I thought this is a good opportunity for all of us, civil society, to look into strategies on what they can do. I think the least is put it on the agenda and have a discussion so people out there, victims out there, wouldn't feel that you've totally forgotten about them. So while conflicts raging unabated in a small number of countries is of concern, I would say about 9 or 10 countries that are in conflict, we have to recognize though that, and it's very heartening, that the greater number of states across the globe are making serious efforts to advance the UN agenda to advance human rights. And why is this the case? I would say credit for that should go to the countless brave and committed civil society activists, human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, universities, scholars who over decades have slowly succeeded in firmly rooting international human rights norms in their societies. And of course in the UN, as I said earlier this afternoon, it was because of civil society and their demand that the UN set up an office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, and similarly, the tribunals in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Court are all results of years and years of hard work by human rights defenders. Which brings me to a very important point. I'm deeply concerned about actions and of repression being taken against human rights defenders, not only in Sri Lanka, where the detentions are continuing, where people are being forced to remain silent, are intimidated against complaining about violations such as sexual violations. And I call this the shrinking democratic space. And I think there's an urgent need for that to be expanded. We are witnessing renewed assaults on the democratic space in which civil society actors operate. So rather than engaging in a dialogue to address the root causes underlying protests, some governments are adopting measures to restrict public freedoms and are resorting to violent repression of any kind of protest or governmental organizations, effectively disabling them from doing their human rights work or criticizing their governments for violations. So in addition, they face threats, imprisonment, and harassment. The Office of the High Commissioner keeps the statistics on this, and it's truly shocking the number of journalists who are in detention or sentenced to huge terms of imprisonment. Bloggers, there's a blogger in Vietnam who's been sentenced to 18 years imprisonment just for sending a blog. Many civil society organizations, human rights defenders, journalists, political opponents continue to operate in an increasingly hostile environment in many countries. You would not be able to do your good work here if you were under restrictions such as this. The restrictive laws are being passed by government after government. And then those laws prohibit NGOs from receiving funding from the outside. And various other restrictions on the levels to which they can criticize governments. They are seen as agitators intent on overthrowing the government. So I think this is very deeply frustrating. I looked at the laws before I left. I looked at the Russian law, spoke to the Russian ambassador about it, and he said to me they copied the Canadian law on it. And these laws, Ethiopia, everyone else is following these laws, passing these laws, because each leader is telling the other, why do you allow your people to humiliate you like that? You know, you shouldn't allow it. And to my horror, South Africa has a bill ready in Parliament to pass similar law. And I alerted the university audience about this. None of them knew about this. So before I left my office during my last term, I issued the OHCHR Management Plan for 2014-2017, in which I introduced for the first time as a new thematic priority, widening the democratic space. This placed emphasis on the work of human rights defenders, the media, public freedoms, and human rights education. Enlarging and deepening people's participation in local, national, and global processes, I believe, is the way forward to societies that are stable and just. And it's very, very important that they watch the international world and the General Assembly, Human Rights Council, and so on. Our challenge will be to ensure that governments are more accountable and respond without discrimination to the needs of the people, so that the poor and marginalized can also participate in decision making. Now, very much of what I've said is acutely applicable to Sri Lanka, because through your effort you got to the point where at least the Sri Lankan government allowed the resolution to be passed by consensus. So they agreed to the resolution. They undertook to come up with a comprehensive implementation of all those undertakings, including justice, accountability, attending to releasing people from detention, IDPs, disappearances. And according to all accounts, some steps have been taken, but nothing impressive. So there's a very urgent need for us to send very strong signals that it's time for words is over. It's now time for action on the part of the Sri Lankan government. So I will stop there because my main point to you is the importance of human rights defenders. So if people like you, human rights activists, are not given space to function, then democracy is threatened. Violations will continue unabated. And so I also belong to I'm on the board of the International Services for Human Rights in Geneva. They've come up with a very good draft statute for a national law protecting human rights defenders. And about 20 odd states have approved that. And I suggest do look on the website for things like this. These are all strategies we can use to protect our brave colleagues in Sri Lanka who are looking for an end to violations and delivery of all the promises made by the government. So thank you very much.